Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I've been mic'd up with this really cool Britney Spears microphone. Unfortunately for you, that's where the similarities stop. I don't sound or look anything like her. If you think I do, please get your eyes checked. I am very, very worried about you. So I'm going to talk about microservices today. But before we get started, I would actually quickly like to introduce myself to you. Some of you maybe know me, but I think most of you don't. My name is Lisa. I'm a 30-something person because, you know, ladies never talk about age, and please don't ask us. I'm a backend developer at Otto, and I have a very, very, very big love for anything DevOps. So if I see good Terraform code, my heart just melts. And I should never be left alone when doing front end. So this should give you an indication of what to expect in terms of slides. I've seen a lot of good slides today and yesterday. Let me promise you, it's all going to be downhill from here. So also, actually, just a fun fact about myself. I once met Emma Watson in New York City. If you want to hear the full story, come hit me up sometime today. I'll be around. And also, I love gummy bears. I hope you do too. OK, so before we dive into the topic really quickly, I want to do a quick recap with you. Maybe a short show of hands. Who's seen this image before? Some of you not. In case you don't know what a microservice is, microservices are supposed to be a solution to everything. We used to have big monoliths that had like all the code, one repository, 50 environments, everything was horrible. And then somebody was like, maybe we should like start splitting that up and like have like smaller repositories, call them micro. Do away with the big bulky monolith that like every developer has nightmares about, and then everything is going to be perfect. Independent teams, everyone gets to do what they want. You know, it sounds like a good idea. You know, that's kind of like what they told us. And you know, so a lot of us start to switch to microservices. And at first it's like great. You're like, oh man, this is so cute. It's simple. It's easy. It's fluffy. It's perfect. You're just in love. And then, you know, you start working with it, you start adding code to it and everything. And then one day you kind of wake up, you turn around, and then you look at this. And you're like, how in the world did I get here? Like, what happened? So that's kind of what I want to talk to you about, you know, because that's usually the moment when you realize, microservices, maybe not so great. It's like the roommate you thought was a good idea because you're going to split rent, but then you wake up and you realize, oh, they're going to leave their dirty dishes in the sink, and they never close the lid of the toilet, and they kind of use up all the milk that's in the fridge. And then you're like, okay, how am I getting out of this? So yeah, let's just dive right into it. I have 3 different areas I want to introduce to you today where I personally think microservices are like the roommate you kind of don't want to have. And the first one is you keep solving the same problem. So maybe you're like, but like, what does that mean? So maybe if you want to, you can close your eyes with me. So you close your eyes, you imagine it's Monday. You had a great weekend, you went to the code.talks, you heard a lot of cool talks, everything was great, fun. You went to a party, you wake up on Monday, you dial into the daily, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get a great ticket. And then you look at the ticket that's been assigned to you, and you're like, haven't I done this before? I feel like I've just done this 2 weeks ago. And to that I say, maybe you have, most certainly yes. And for everyone, you know, who's now wondering, like, Lisa, what are you talking about? Let's look at a real-life example. So I brought you actually a short screen. Look, this is part of a screenshot, actually. This is not even all of it. So this is a real-life example of a team that I worked in, and that is their microservice infrastructure. And I should remember this because we're going to come back to this, and you know, don't worry about reading it. I know it's too small. But something that I would like to show you here is, you know, when you look at this, there's certain things that are kind of repetitive. So if you've worked with GCP before, I know we have like some cool GCP experts. I hope you've seen their talk, because then you know what a Cloud Run is. So the Cloud Run is the cool pointy arrowy thing that's kind of occurring in this picture over and over again. And these are microservices. And from this very small extract of an infrastructure, you can see there's like, I think 7 or 8 of them in there. And you know, just to highlight this again, this is just one team. This is not like a lot of teams, just one team. So maybe from this you can tell, okay, there are certain things that you're kind of repeating yourself over and over again. So let's get into more of an example. So let's say you're a team, you're starting out with microservices, you're like, oh yeah, cool, microservice is fun. Let's get going, let's set this up. So you start out with one microservice. So, you do certain things that you need. You kind of set up your framework. You're like, oh, I'm a Spring person, I'm a Flask person, I'm like a whatever person. So you put that in there. And then, you have like your business code in there. Maybe you're like an event-driven architecture like I am. So you have like a publisher and like a consumer. You have DTOs that basically always look the same because whatever is coming in is like slightly changed, so but a tiny bit, and then you save it, and then you spit back out again. So like incoming, outgoing DTO, you're like, I don't know which is which. And then maybe you're like, oh yeah, I want to run this in the cloud. Seems like a good idea. So I'm going to add some infrastructure as code. So in case somebody accidentally deletes it, I'm able to recreate it. And then they're like, oh yeah, cool, I'm done. And then, the business scope of your team kind of grows. There's more things that you need to add to it. And then you're like, oh, maybe, this is like kind of different from what I've done before. It's not like the same business scope. So maybe it makes sense to start a second microservice. So you start a second microservice. You get going. You're like, oh yeah, I'm going to need my framework. I'm going to, do like my business code setup. Probably I'm going to need some sort of consumer and producer. Then also like, yeah, automatic creation through the pipeline with some infrastructure as code. Seems like a good idea. And then you kind of look at it and you're like, hang on, I feel like I've seen this before, haven't I? And the answer to this is yes. So, this is actually underlying what I'm, trying to tell you. You keep doing the same things over and over again. And probably most of you are like, let's say all of you are really smart developers, and you're probably saying like, yeah, Lisa, but there's ways to avoid redundancies, right? To that, I say, yes, there is. You can extract certain things into libraries, saying repetitive code, so you extract it out, or you can have, wrapper classes for your DTOs if they follow like a certain cloud event structure, or you can also have like universal builders. Like my team that I worked at used a lot of T builders. If you want to know what that is, come hit me up after. I really don't want to get into it. Maybe you can also make use of loops in your infrastructure as code. So like all of these are really great ideas, but there's always a but. There's some repetition that is just inevitable and that you're never going to get around. So there are certain things. So let's say you make use of a framework in your microservices. Well, that framework setup is always going to be there. Maybe you're making use of some really great integrations that are in your framework. For example, I use Spring, and there's a great Kafka integration. But it's so deeply intertwined into the framework that you can't extract it out into a separate library. So you keep writing the same Kafka listener over and over again because you need to. Also, maybe there's like some dependencies in your infrastructure, or you want to avoid dependencies in your infrastructure's code. You want to be able to deploy all of your different microservices independently from one another. So you have infrastructure as code set up in all of your individual repositories. So you're actually just, able to deploy that. And then, while talking about deployment, there's probably also going to be a lot of repetitive code in your deploy pipelines itself. So you're going to have building blocks. Oh, this is the deployment building block. This is the testing building block. And you have that in every single repository. And these are kind of things you need to have, and you can't get rid of them in like all of these different places. And, that is just within your team. If you come from like a large organization like I do, there's a lot of intra-team redundancies. So I'm building microservices in the cloud, and so is the next team next door, and they have the same infrastructure as code, they have the same business logics, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe they also have their libraries, which are probably 98% of the same that I have in my team, but we're not sharing because we're independent teams. Okay, second reason. Microservices aren't necessarily less complicated. We've been told like, oh yeah, microservices, easy, cute, fun, everything is going to be great. And to that, yeah, I say yes at the beginning. You start migrating away from the monolith. You're like, oh, this is my tiny chunk of code that I'm going to take from the monolith, refactor it, make it, runnable in the cloud and all these different things. So you start building that, and everything feels nice and cute and fluffy at first. You're like, oh, this is so cute. I want to take it home with me. But then, business happens as always. So you start adding more functionality to your microservice. And then it's like, oh yeah, by the way, there's this deadline. So could you please, do this faster than you usually would? And then you start to build a code that's maybe not as perfect. And then, maybe you're doing something in the microservice that you've done in another microservice as well, but you can't really remember where. And so it's kind of like in both places, it works almost the same, but it's kind of different, And then one morning you're waking up and then this happens. You're looking at just a bunch of spaghetti code and you're like, hang on, wasn't this like ultra cute and fluffy like 5 minutes ago? Maybe. So coming back to this example, because I think this is a good visualization of what I'm trying to say. My team that I worked in, of which is like, this is just a partial screenshot of their infrastructure. They started out with 2 microservices, and they consumed 2 events, and they published 1. And then this is like, I think, a year and a half in. So, you're starting to add new features, because usually like your team will have some sort of scope, but you're not just going to finish that one service and then be done with it and be like, okay, yeah, now we're going to, I don't know, maybe get rid of some technical debt, and then the rest of the year, we're going to play Tetris or whatever. You will always start adding things to the existing functionality that you have. And then, because one microservice might get too big, you start to have another microservice, and then you maybe need something different. You need like a translation layer because the other team is not asynchronous, so they have an API, so you need to make the synchronous communication asynchronous, and there's all these different things going on. And then, you kind of start looking at this. And then you're like, how in the world did I get here? So usually it's very simple, like you think, okay, I'm going to take my big monolith. It's like super huge, super complex. I really hate it, so I'm going to start breaking it up. And that's usually a good idea. But something that a lot of organizations don't take into account is if you have a lot of complexity within your business processes, just splitting it up into smaller chunks of code is not going to make it less complex. So, also with organizations, if you build a product, it's not always going to stay the same. You're always going to try to invent new features, start adding new functionalities, and that's then also going to increase the complexity. And all of that will be reflected in your code. And then if there's like bad business decisions that go along with them, for example, like you have a bad team split, maybe you don't have real masters or owners of certain processes, maybe you have overlapping responsibilities, teams will start to have to build workarounds that are really nasty and really dirty. I've seen a couple of things that have been really, really bad because there's been bad business decisions. And tech was like, can we please not do it like this? And business was like, we understand your point, but this decision has been made by management, so yes, we have to do it like that. And that's then the moment where you're like, yeah, okay, so tech is not going to solve our business problems. Yeah. So let's move on to the third point. Deploying new features isn't always faster when working with microservices. So, there's been this whole thing like, oh yeah, with microservices, we're going to have independent teams. They're going to be able to deploy independently from one another. Everything is great. Everything is cool. So maybe let's look at an example. So let's say you have a web shop, and let's say you're selling washing machines. And you're like, you know what would be great? People order a washing machine. Would be great if there's an installation service. Like you get your washing machine, not everyone has the tools, not everyone wants to carry it up to the 5th floor with no elevator. Some people don't know what goes where, so, sounds like a good idea. So you're like, okay, I'm gonna reach out to the checkout team and tell them, you know what, it would be great if we have this service available in the checkout. People can just click a box, add it to their card, order it, great. And then you're like, okay, maybe I feel like I'm missing something. And then you're like, you know what, it would actually be great if that would also show up on the product detail page, so people actually know about it. So you're like, okay, so I'm going to reach out to those guys and also tell them to put that feature in there so we can kind of advertise it, and people, when they're browsing for washing machines, no, we actually have this service. And then you're like, hang on, so if people have it in their cart, I also actually need to inform like the invoice team so that it's actually, shown on the invoice as well. And then like, oh yeah, and then there's the my account section. Okay, people should probably know that they've ordered this so that they can double check if they actually put it in there. So you're like, okay, I also need to hit up those guys. And they're like, I've got everything, right? To that I say, no, because I'm a backend developer and front is not everything. So you kind of realize, oh yeah, so I have this service. I actually need to inform the carrier about this so that the person who's going to deliver the washing machine knows he's going to have to carry it 5 flights of stairs and actually install it. So you're like, okay, I'm going to hit up those guys. And then you're like, hang on, I have to do accounting stuff, so I actually need to keep track of this and have it in my accounting system. Okay, so you're like, oh, okay, another team, I'm going to hit up them so that they're going to take have track of that as well. And then you're like, you know what, now that I've introduced this new feature, it would be kind of cool. We would actually have some data about it. So you're like, okay, I'm going to hit up my analysis team that they're also going to add it to their table so we can have some cool reports and dashboards on it. And then you're like, oh, damn, I also have to, integrate with other teams. And then you're kind of hitting this point. You're like, I thought it was one little feature. I thought, we have microservices. This is supposed to be fun and easy and quick. Like, how in the world did I get here? And now you're probably like saying, oh my God, please help me, Lisa. I don't know what's going on. Can I somehow close Pandora's box? To that I say, yeah, there are certain things that make life easier, but you're never going to get rid of this problem altogether. So there are certain things that you can use, like CDCs. So CDCs are consumer-driven contracts, so the consumer defines what kind of data they're expecting, which allows teams to work somewhat independently of one another. You can also have business analysts in place who are first going to actually figure out which teams have to be involved in the new feature and what they have to add, so that you have first an overview of what you need to do, and then you can actually start tackling it. And you can also make use of feature toggles. So if different teams have different timelines, one team might be able to do it this month, the other team says, well, maybe 6 months, we don't know yet. So, you can make use of feature toggles and have different teams being able to turn features on and off whenever they need it. Yeah, but these are, small fixes. But, Pandora's box is always going to be there, so I'm sorry. So now you're probably thinking like, oh my God, it's all horrible. Should I really work with microservices? Feels like a really bad idea. I don't know. Lisa said, there's all these horror stories. I don't know. Am I going to have sleepless nights again? Is it going to be the same with the monolith all over again? To that I say, no. If you live in a microservice world, it's great. Keep it. Don't go away. If you have a monolith, consider switching. Microservices also have a lot of advantages. You actually have independent developer teams that can work with the tech stack that is most suitable for them and for which they're actually able to find developers that want to work with them. You do have a somewhat reduced complexity because, you have your one microservice. If you're going to change something, it's not like poking the monolith that maybe has a test coverage of 50%, and you never really know what's going to happen when you change that one line of code, and you just kind of hope it's not going to break. Also, you can kind of get rid of a lot of the different environments. Back in the day, we had pre-testing, pre-testing, Felix testing environment, something similar to live, pre-live, something that should be live but isn't, and then there maybe is live. So you can kind of reduce that complexity if you have reduced functionality that you need to test. So that's also really nice. And in some cases, if you want to, deploy really small changes, you can be very quick. So I've seen a sign that said I only have about 2 minutes left, so maybe let's wrap things up. So microservices are great. They're freaking cute. They're amazing. I love them. I wouldn't want to miss them for the world. But, there are certain things that you have to keep in mind when you start working with them. They still require a lot of planning. They require a lot of good architecture design. And actually, they require business to also reduce complexity and make things work in a better way than they used to in the monolith, which is something that a lot of people don't really want to realize. Yeah, an intra-team dependency is something that is real. Okay, before we do questions, just one little thing. If you liked what you heard, if you want to see more memes, we're actually going to have a meetup at Otto where we're going to also talk about more cloud stuff. My really awesome colleague who's also here, Moritz, is going to join me. He's a lot funnier than I am and also cuter, so it's really worth joining us. So if you're Hamburg-based, I really would love to see you there. Okay, and then let's move on to question. If there are any, if you have a question, throw some nachos at me or something. Oh yeah, thank you.